the foundational bedrock of American democracy, the sacred, century-old separation between apolitical military service and partisan political loyalty, has just suffered a seismic and perhaps irreparable shift. In an unprecedented move that has sent massive shockwaves rippling from the fortified halls of the Pentagon to the inner sanctums of the West Wing, a formidable coalition of 38 elite military leaders has taken a stand that was previously unthinkable in the American experiment. This group, which includes 7 highly decorated 4-star generals and a cadre of retired and active duty commanders, has formally issued a joint declaration explicitly refusing to affirm Donald Trump's authority as Commander-in-Chief. This is not a nuanced policy critique or a whispered disagreement shared in the shadowed hallways of a government building. It is a public, scorched-earth rebuke of the highest order. These are individuals who have spent 40-plus years adhering to the rigid, non-negotiable principle of civilian control of the military, yet they have now concluded that the current leadership represents a departure so radical that silence is no longer a professional virtue, but a national liability. The gravity of this declaration cannot be overstated, as it effectively shatters the traditional silent professional code that has governed military executive relations since the founding of the Republic. By stepping into the public square, these commanders are signaling that the traditional guardrails designed to keep the armed forces insulated from the whims of domestic politics have not just been strained, but entirely dismantled. This is a collective alarm bell being rung by the very people tasked with the nation's most sensitive secrets and its most lethal capabilities. Their refusal to recognize the legitimacy of the Commander-in-Chief's operational directive suggests a total breakdown in the chain of trust that allows a democracy to function. This unfolding crisis, which pits the nation's highest-ranking warriors against its highest-ranking civilian official, is poised to dominate the national landscape for months to come, forcing a constitutional reckoning that may fundamentally redefine the relationship between the White House and the war room. Furthermore, the timing and the sheer scale of this coalition suggest a level of coordination and desperation that is historically unique. These leaders are not political firebrands or social media influencers. They are institutionalists who have traditionally viewed public dissent as a betrayal of their uniform. Their decision to go on the record implies that they have exhausted every private channel, every internal memorandum, and every quiet protest available within the Department of Defense. By declaring an open refusal to affirm authority, they are essentially throwing the gears of the executive branch into a deadlock, presenting a challenge to the administration that cannot be solved with a simple firing or a dismissive tweet. As this situation develops, it moves beyond a mere headline and becomes an existential question for the United States. What happens to a global superpower when its military leadership no longer trusts the hand that holds the pen? The question that must be asked is, what could possibly drive these career-long institutionalists, individuals whose very identities are forged in the fires of discipline and chain of command, such a desperate and unprecedented extreme? The answer lies in a shocking letter released today at 3:47 p.m. ET, a document that reads less like a policy memorandum and more like an indictment of a systemic collapse in executive ethics. These commanders allege a calculated 14-month pattern in which the White House consistently and deliberately prioritized campaign optics and domestic political gains over the cold, hard requirements of national security and military readiness. This was not a series of isolated mistakes or bureaucratic lapses. Rather, the declaration paints a picture of a deliberate strategy to treat the most sensitive functions of the Department of Defense as mere extensions of a political communications office. This shift signals a radical departure from the traditional understanding of the presidency, moving away from a role of stewardship and toward one of transactional exploitation, where the safety of the nation is treated as a secondary concern to the success of a news cycle. The declaration highlights 3 specific, alarming incidents that serve as the pillars of this accusation, the first being what is now termed the October intelligence breach. This involved an abrupt, chaotic withdrawal from a vital Middle East intelligence post, a node critical for tracking regional terrorist movements and state actor aggression. The order was reportedly issued just hours after a raucous campaign rally, bypassing every established protocol and, most crucially, occurring without a single minute of consultation with field commanders who were responsible for the lives of the personnel on the ground. By stripping away this strategic asset in a fit of political impulsivity, the administration signaled that the complex geometry of global intelligence is subservient to the immediate needs of a political narrative. This was followed by the NATO blockade in January, an alleged halting of a long-planned joint training exercise that was essential for maintaining the interoperability of the Western Alliance. The motive behind this cancellation was reportedly retaliatory rather than strategic. The exercise was reportedly frozen because the commanding admiral had the professional audacity to testify, honestly, before Congress regarding the severe budget deficits facing his fleet. This use of a multinational military exercise as a tool for personal or political retribution sent a chilling message to every officer in the Pentagon. Professional candor would now be met with operational sabotage. However, the most chilling and morally indefensible allegation involves the February 9th directive. According to the coalition of leaders, a direct order was issued to withhold life-saving emergency equipment and defensive systems from a forward operating base, a location documented to be facing imminent threats, until the presiding generals agreed to a quid pro quo of the most cynical variety. The condition for the release of these critical supplies was that the generals must agree to appear at a choreographed White House political event designed to celebrate military strength and offer implicit endorsements of the administration's policies. This represents a terrifying transition from mere policy disagreement into the realm of using operational command as a literal bargaining chip for political theater. When the logistics of survival for American service members are held hostage for the sake of a televised photo opportunity, the fundamental moral contract between the state and its protectors is essentially dissolved. This is no longer a debate over grand strategy. It is a documented claim that the commander-in-chief viewed the physical safety of American troops as leverage to be spent in the pursuit of political power. The mounting tension between the executive branch and the Department of Defense reached a definitive boiling point on February 11th, a day that many historians may eventually view as the start of a modern constitutional crisis. The catalyst was the surfacing of a classified directive, allegedly bearing Donald Trump's personal signature, which was leaked to the Senate Armed Services Committee. This was not merely a document of strategic disagreement, it was a paper trail of a perceived quid pro quo that struck at the heart of military ethics. The directive reportedly laid out a chillingly specific instruction. A 72-hour hold was to be placed on critical resupply approvals for a forward operating base that was documented to be facing an imminent and high-level threat. The release of these essential supplies, ranging from ammunition to advanced defensive hardware, was explicitly conditioned on the public cooperation of 3 four-star commanders. Specifically, the White House allegedly demanded that these high-ranking officers appear on national television to praise administration defense policies and offer personal endorsements of the president's leadership. When the members of the Senate Armed Services Committee reviewed the document behind closed doors on February 12th, the atmosphere was described as one of stunned disbelief. The gravity of the revelation was perhaps best articulated by Senator Michael Thornton, a Republican and a former Marine, whose reputation for institutional loyalty is well known on both sides of the aisle. Thornton, visibly shaken, reportedly told his colleagues that in his 40 years of service to the nation, both in uniform and in the halls of Congress, he had never witnessed such a blatant and dangerous breach of the ethical compact that governs civil-military relations. For Thornton, and many of his peers, the directive represented a crossing of the Rubicon, where the physical safety of American troops was no longer a sacred duty, but a pawn to be traded for a more favorable news cycle. The document suggested that the president was willing to gamble with the lives of service members in a combat zone to secure a political optics victory at home. The immediate legislative fallout was swift, yet ultimately insufficient to contain the brewing rebellion. 11 senators from both parties, led by the weight of Thornton's condemnation, immediately drafted a formal request for an emergency investigation by the Pentagon Inspector General. They sought to determine if the directive constituted a violation of federal statutes prohibiting the use of government resources for campaign purposes, and whether it represented a dereliction of the president's fundamental duties. However, the clock was ticking faster than the Senate's investigative machinery could turn. The military leaders named in the directive, and those who had seen the consequences of the delay unfolding in real time, realized that a standard bureaucratic inquiry could take months, time they believed they did not have. Fearing that the chain of command was being permanently corrupted, and that more lives would be put at risk for political leverage, they made the agonizing decision to bypass the traditional channels and take their case directly to the American people. The formal and historic breaking of silence took place at precisely 3:30 p.m. today within the hallowed wood-paneled halls of the National Press Club. an event that will likely be remembered as the definitive rupture in modern civil-military relations. The atmosphere was thick with a heavy, somber tension as the room fell into a stunned hush, broken only by the rapid-fire clicking of camera shutters. At the center of the podium stood retired General Marcus Caldwell, a four-star Army veteran and former vice-chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, whose reputation for stoic professionalism has made him a titan in the defense community for decades. He was not alone. Flanking him in a silent, unified front were Admiral Jennifer Hartley and Lieutenant General Robert Hayes, two officers whose combined century of service represents the very pinnacle of American strategic command. This was not a gathering of political activists or disgruntled former employees. This was a phalanx of the nation's most senior military minds, standing together in a public forum to perform an act they had spent their entire careers being trained to avoid a public challenge to the sitting President of the United States. General Caldwell's address was nothing short of searing, delivered with a voice that grew firmer and more resonant with every sentence. He began by grounding his remarks in the long tradition of the American military's nonpartisan nature, emphasizing that he and his colleagues have served presidents from both sides of the aisle with unwavering loyalty and without ever publicly questioning civilian leadership. However, he transitioned into a devastating critique, stating that their professional code of silence ends where the endangerment of American lives for political gain begins. He articulated a profound moral crisis, explaining that they could no longer remain silent or complicit when the safety and operational security of service members are treated as mere currency to be spent on the pursuit of political endorsements. To Caldwell and his peers, the revelation of the February 9th directive was the final straw, a betrayal of the sacred trust that exists between the commander who gives the orders and the soldiers, who must execute them in harm's way. The core message radiating from that podium was unmistakable and terrifying in its clarity. The fundamental compact between the military and the state, which has held the Republic together since its inception, has been fundamentally broken. Caldwell argued that when a commander-in-chief views military operations not as a tool of national survival, but as tokens to be traded for televised praise and campaign optics, the office loses its moral authority. He characterized the administration's actions as an abandonment of the commander-in-chief's primary duty to protect those who protect the nation. By standing before the world's media, these leaders were signaling that the rot had reached the highest levels of decision-making and that the risk of staying quiet had finally surpassed the risk of speaking out. This was a declaration that the military's loyalty belongs to the Constitution and the lives of the troops, not to the personal political ambitions of any single individual, regardless of their title. The gravity of this crisis stems from how sharply it deviates from the historical precedents that have previously defined the boundaries of American civil-military friction. While history books often point to President Truman's dramatic dismissal of General Douglas MacArthur in 1951 to preserve civilian control, or the more recent, dignified exit of James Mattis in 2019, those instances involved individuals operating within the established rules of the system. MacArthur was fired for insubordination, and Mattis resigned quietly, waiting years before offering even measured public criticism. What we are witnessing today is a radical departure, a unified front of active and retired leaders who are not waiting for the distance of history or the comfort of retirement to voice their concerns. Instead, they are speaking out in real time, utilizing their collective platform to label the current administration's actions as an existential threat to the very integrity of the United States Armed Forces. They argue that the traditional guardrails have not just been bent, but completely dismantled, leaving the military vulnerable to a level of partisan manipulation that the founders specifically sought to prevent. The coalition's joint declaration provides a meticulously detailed autopsy of this institutional decay, outlining a three-pronged erosion that threatens to hollow out the military from the inside. The first pillar of their concern is the blatant politicization of the promotion process, where career advancement is allegedly no longer tied to strategic brilliance or professional competence, but to a commander's willingness to echo the administration's political talking points. This is compounded by the second pillar, the systematic exclusion of independent military advice, with senior leaders being pushed out of the decision-making loop whenever their expert assessments conflict with the White House's political messaging. However, it is the third pillar, direct operational interference, that carries the most immediate and terrifying implications. This is not a debate over high-level policy or budget allocations. It is an accusation that the White House has reached its hand into the tactical cockpit of military operations, pausing or accelerating time-sensitive missions based on the perceived loyalty of the officers in charge. The most devastating evidence of this interference was delivered by Admiral Jennifer Hartley during today's press conference, where she moved beyond abstract concerns to reveal a staggering human cost. Hartley confirmed that during the specific 48-hour delay of the defensive equipment package in February, a delay mandated by the White House while it sought political endorsements, the forward operating base in question came under heavy hostile fire because the enhanced defensive systems were sitting in a warehouse awaiting political clearance rather than being deployed on the perimeter. The base was left vulnerable. The result was tragic. 3 American service members were wounded in the attack. These individuals are not just statistics. They are casualties of a delay that had absolutely nothing to do with strategic necessity, logistical hurdles, or weather conditions. They were placed in harm's way because their superior officers had not yet delivered the sufficient level of political praise demanded by the executive branch. This revelation transforms the crisis from a constitutional debate into a moral indictment, suggesting that the lives of those in uniform have been used as collateral in a high-stakes game of political coercion. The legal and constitutional ramifications of this defiance are being characterized by scholars as the most significant civil-military crisis the United States has faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Across the political spectrum, the consensus among legal experts is one of profound alarm. Figures ranging from Michael Chertoff, the former Homeland Security Secretary under George W. Bush, to the prominent conservative legal scholar John Yoo, have coalesced around a singular, disturbing conclusion: using the immense power of the commander-in-chief to extort political endorsements from military commanders represents a constitutional red line that has been decisively crossed. Chertoff has noted that the allegations, if substantiated, could constitute a clear violation of federal statutes prohibiting the use of government resources for campaign purposes, while Yu emphasized that the president's authority to command the military is a public trust, not a personal asset to be used for political coercion. The overarching sentiment among experts is that if the executive branch can successfully leverage the safety of troops for partisan gain, the very foundation of the separation of powers is in jeopardy. Rather than moving to de-escalate this unprecedented tension or provide a factual rebuttal to the specific charges laid out in the February 9th directive, the White House response has served only to fuel the fire. In a series of combative posts on Truth Social, Donald Trump bypassed any mention of the evidence, choosing instead to launch a barrage of personal vitriol against the signatories. He dismissed the group of 38 highly decorated leaders as washed-up failures and bitter losers who were likely being paid by his political opponents to undermine his administration's perceived military successes. By naming General Caldwell and Admiral Hartley specifically and labeling them as frauds, the president shifted the battleground from one of policy and legality to one of character assassination. In the specialized world of high-stakes crisis management, this tactic, attacking the messenger rather than the message, is widely viewed as a desperate admission that no viable factual defense exists. If the directive were a forgery or the events misrepresented, the logical move would be to release the original document and prove it. Instead, the administration's reliance on conspiracy framing suggests a profound lack of accountability. This aggressive stance from the White House has created an environment where the truth is being treated as a secondary casualty to political survival. By framing the military leader's dissent as a partisan deep state attack, the administration is effectively telling the American public that even the most senior, nonpartisan military officials cannot be trusted if their observations conflict with the executive narrative. This rhetoric does not just target the 38 commanders in the coalition, it sends a warning to every active duty officer currently serving that professional integrity will be met with public humiliation and professional exile. The result is a dangerous stalemate, a military leadership that believes its commander-in-chief is violating the law, and a president who believes he is above the scrutiny of his generals. As this legal and political warfare intensifies, the country is left staring into a vacuum of authority, where the impeccable records of 38 leaders are being weighed against the singular, unyielding defiance of the Oval Office. We have moved beyond the realm of abstract theory, partisan preference, or water-cooler political debate. We are now staring directly into a fundamental crisis that threatens the very structural integrity of the American experiment. The central harrowing question facing the nation is whether the United States will tacitly accept a new degraded system where life-and-death military operations are treated as pausable events, subject to the delivery of campaign-ready soundbites. If this behavior by the executive branch goes unchecked and without significant consequence, it does not merely stain a single administration, it establishes a toxic, irreversible precedent that will haunt American national security for generations. It creates a blueprint for every future occupant of the Oval Office, signaling that the armed forces are no longer a neutral shield for the Constitution, but a high-value campaign tool to be wielded for domestic leverage. Once the boundary is blurred between a commander's duty to the troops and a politician's desire for a polling boost, the bright line of military nonpartisanship, a norm that has ensured the peaceful transfer of power for over 2 centuries, may never be fully restored. The downstream effects of this shift on the internal culture of the military are equally catastrophic. This crisis signals to every rising officer, from the newest second lieutenant to the veteran brigadier general, that professional survival and promotion are no longer tied to strategic brilliance, tactical competence, or moral character, but rather to a willingness to perform as a political surrogate. When loyalty to a specific leader's personal brand trumps loyalty to the mission and the Constitution, the meritocracy that makes the U.S. military the most effective fighting force on earth begins to hollow out from within. This environment breeds a yes-man culture where independent military advice is stifled, and where commanders are forced to weigh every operational necessity against its potential to offend or please political masters. In such a system, the smartest and most principled leaders are often the first to be purged or pushed into early retirement, leaving behind a command structure defined by its political utility rather than its ability to win the nation's wars. Finally, the impact of this domestic decay on the global stage cannot be ignored. Our adversaries, be they state actors or insurgent groups, are watching this internal rupture with keen interest, recognizing that a military distracted by political loyalty tests is a military that is fundamentally weakened. It signals to the world that American defense decisions are no longer dictated by cold, strategic necessity or the defense of international alliances, but are instead subject to the volatile whims of domestic polling and campaign cycles. If an ally cannot be certain that a resupply ship will arrive unless their commanding officer praises the American president on television, the credibility of U.S. security guarantees effectively evaporates. For the American service member on the ground, this means they are increasingly at risk, not just from enemy fire, but from the calculated delays of their own government. This is the existential cost of the current crisis, a future where the American flag represents not a unified national will, but a fractured command structure where the safety of the soldier is secondary to the optics of the state.